Look at that. Everybody's getting it except YouTube. Ah, there we go. All right, as I was explaining to all the other Facebook and Instagram people, I'm new to the multicasting. There's lots of buttons that one needs to flip. So here we are. You missed the first part of the stream. But I will quickly review because YouTube actually provides the best archive of this stuff, and I would like this to be worthwhile for everybody. So welcome. I'm Peter from Sensel, and I'm going to consider this the actual beginning. And I will skip some of the early stuff and all the commentary. You can go to Facebook for that on that archive if you're really interested. But I will go through my BEAP patch here again and explain what we have. So I will show you what I have. And as I struggle with all my mechanics, there we go. So there we go. Hi. Here I am. I've got my Morph and I've got Max. So with my Max patch, what we have here is kind of a simple synthesizer. I'm going to skip the basics of Max that I explained earlier, except to say that it is a visual programming environment, and what you do in that is much like a modular synthesizer. You use wires to patch together logic. So instead of sound sources and sound modifiers and modulators of strictly audio, in Max you can do that same sort of thing to data, logic. You can do it to sound and video. And unlike programming in a text-based language, everything happens in real time, so you get instant feedback about what you're doing. So it's a lot more like music in that you're constantly sort of listening to your, whether or not you're using audio, but you are sort of paying attention to what you're doing and getting feedback all the time. And the wonderful thing about this is if you're new to programming or have struggled with text-based languages that seem maybe too terse, Max is really kind of a nice way to constantly get feedback and know that you've done the right thing or the wrong thing. And so with that, we have a really simple patch here, and I'm going to go to just this screen here and give you the full view of the patch. So what I explained earlier was that what we're using here to get the MIDI polyphonic expression data, which Max handles really well, in order to get all of these gestures from the Morph into something simple, I'm using the sort of the BEAP series of objects. So most objects in Max look kind of like this. They're very, with a little box with a word in there, maybe something with an operator like addition. And from that you can actually make things happen. I guess I can't resist going into the basics. All right. So now we have a little calculator there. And so imagine those are, instead of just numbers and addition, that they could be very complicated processes or audio or video or data from a weather station in Santiago, Chile. You really can bring anything into Max and push it out to anything. Unlike a lot of other languages, so if you want to do something like that in Python, you either have to write your own libraries to handle audio or handle video, or use somebody else's library that you have to find. With Max, everything's in there. And then there are, of course, a lot of extensions that you can use. And we actually use that in here. So what I have here is just showing the values, the terse sort of numerical values. When we do something fancy with it, I'm using the Rise keyboard object from BEAP. So BEAP is a collection of sort of metal modules and that do things much like this modular synthesizer I have on my desk. They do a lot of things inside and they look nice. So with this Rise keyboard, that came from the Rolly package from the package manager. And I had to do some modifications, and those modifications are in the example patches that I provide on our GitHub. All of the things that I'm showing here are on GitHub. So what this does is it shows me visually my touches on the morph, which is really, okay, great. I know something's happening. I know I've got the right thing started. I've got a little menu here that allows me to select my morph or whatever MIDI source I want to use. And then a patch cord that selects it in here and gets the data in. What comes out of this is really it's audio rate data that describes pitch and the velocity and my gestures, just up and down and gliding left and right and after pressure and my lift velocity. So all of that important gesture data you can now just patch freely. It's lovely. So I found an oscillator, which is this nice wavetable oscillator. And so that's sort of my primary sound source. And I am just using pitch and pressure on that one. So the pressure is morphing between the waves in the wavetable. We can hear that if I bypass these. So as I use my pressure, let me bring my morph up here so you can see what I'm doing. Yes, there we go. And as I apply pressure, I'm really doing the same thing as this knob. And oof, that's hot. And I have this just simply mapped from pressure and drop that in there just as I would with a modular synth. And then I also have this is something to adjust the range of values. So here you see it's kind of going from 0 to, I'll turn that down, from 0 to, I believe it's this one, yes, 0 to 5. So I have to scale that so it's going to the -5 to 5 that this expects. So that allows me to morph this sort of spectral content, and we'll take a listen to that. As I go up and down. And I lose some of that gesture there. Let me turn that up. So now we already have like some of the really fine gestures that we can do on the morph into Max. And again, patching, I do some patching here to, again, adjust that 0 to 5 to -5 to 5. And that is, I believe, the glide, so that's the XY. And that's going to this ladder filter. So I have this extra control over the timbre. So now I've completely rendered the piano meaningless and imparted sort of greater meaning to my relationship with this sound. And then again, a gate from the output of this from the keyboard module here, and that's just going to trigger the envelope. I can graphically adjust that. And again, this is sort of more like Reactor or a modular synthesizer in real life, or any of those sort of like larger block things that you tie together. And so that the X is controlling the ladder. So the cool thing here is like usually if you just drop in an MPE, into an MPE synth in your DAW, that is usually always applied to pitch. And some synthesizers give you control over that, some DAWs do. Other times you just are stuck with that. In Max, you can do whatever you want with that X value. So in this case, I've added extra filtering. And then I dropped in some nice effects, some delay and reverb, just to give it a nice ambient feeling. And I can bring in my modular synth that's just kind of beeping around in the back. So this is all monophonic, and we will get to how to be able to play chords, though we're not really going to touch on that today. So that is my first example, and hopefully we have some questions in YouTube. All right. Cool. Well, there's some folks here. Hopefully you have some questions along the way. So that was my first example of going through these sort of simple objects in Max and avoiding the really granular stuff where we get into the very fine objects. The next thing I want to show is how we can adapt the morph to somebody else's work. So what I showed here is something that's going to requires your own patching and your own introduction to Max. What I also want to emphasize is that with Max is that there's a big community that does a lot of patching. So last week we had Sarah Bell Reed on our Artist Talk series, and we showed the temporal control oscillator. And what I did with that was simply use Max's new MIDI Learn feature, which came in Max 8. So if you're working with an older Max, or if you're like me and have been using Max forever, you may not be aware of that feature. It's kind of funny when you work with something for a long time, you kind of miss a lot of the new stuff because you have your old habits built up. But the cool thing is that it has this nice feature, and so I want to kind of make sure everybody knows about that. So I'm going to close this out, and sure, I'm going to save. And really the simplest way is like, I did actually have a patch for this, but it's not on this computer, sadly. But I can show the basics of how to just do MIDI Learn and get something cool from your morph into Max without really having to know how to patch. And this is a really great way to work with other people who are maybe more into patching. You can use their work and just adapt the morph to it. So probably the easiest way to do this, to demonstrate this, is to throw up some sliders. So I will do a live dot slider, and I'm just going to create a few of these because this will be the simplest way to demonstrate it. So with the morph, with the Buchla Thunder overlay, we have all of our presets. So when I hold this top programmer's bar, I can go to preset 5, which is more geared towards sliders rather than notes and dimensional playing. So with this, we can just sort of take our nice sliders and do these gestures and adapt them to a Max patch. So I need to be out of edit mode. Mappings are this little slider thing here. So I'm going to zoom in. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, I know there's a way to do this. Ah! I lost all my windows. There we go. 3 gesture, 3 finger. No. 3 finger, 2 finger. Okay, well, that's not working. Sorry about that. So I have these sliders, and I put the morph into map mode, which is assign MIDI map. And when I click this little piano keyboard at the bottom here, that turns everything blue, much like you would see in Ableton Live or Bitwig or any number of DAWs that have a MIDI Learn feature. So again, you can just sort of go ahead and Uh-oh. We may be crashing. That's too bad. I think things might be too hot. All right, there we go. So, MIDI learn. Where was I? Yes, so assign MIDI map, and I put this in preset 5. You know what? I need to modify this because I think I have the wrong map on Buchla Thunder. So I need to do our default mapping. All right, that's loud. All right, now I can get something done. Okay, we will try this again. Now, the simplest thing makes things go awry. So I have several sliders that you might see in a patch, and we can go ahead and assign MIDI map and select things and choose my preset 5, and just as you would any other DAW. So this is a really nice new feature in Max. The cool thing is that unlike most MIDI learn, you can actually deal with, it's not a feature, but you can deal with the three-dimensional nature of these hex pads, for example. So if I wanted to apply these this way, I can go ahead and save this mappings file, and it's just a JSON file, which is cool. So I will call this sliders. And I can just edit that with a text editor. I am poorly equipped here. How about TextMate? And the nice thing is it's just JSON, so we can actually modify these things very easily and make these the numbers that we want. So this is a really hacky way of dealing with this, but at least unlike other other situations, you can deal with it. So now I will load mappings. Open it, and I should have this mapped to 3 of my sliders. So that way I don't have to disable different dimensions on this. I can easily make it map to different parameters as I see fit. So that's really kind of the main thing I wanted to show you in Max in dealing with the morph, because this is a sort of tragic problem with a lot of music software, that we can't easily map these lovely 3D controls to a lot of different parameters. we have to sort of like go to the Sensel app and disable an X and a Z and then make Y able to map to something in a software. Because otherwise it gets confused by the stream of all the data when it's trying to learn. In Max, we can just hack it. So that's cool. And it also makes it easy to control other people's software. So that's another way of working with the morph in Max in a really hacky way. So what's a cool way to do it besides that first BEAP example? Let me check. I've got some examples on another computer over here. So the scaling, yes. So this is an important lesson because right now we can apply this stuff and it's all linear. It's not necessarily something to learn from. It's all very obvious, which is nice in some cases, but it's not very subtle or interesting in a lot of other cases. So what we want to do is open up my live stream project. And again, this is on GitHub. And open recent project, live stream v1. Let's see, scaling pressure. So here what I want to describe is lots of different ways. So this is the more working with Max objects rather than the BEAP objects. And what this allows me to do is do interesting things with the morph's pressure. So I'm going to go ahead and put this guy on. And it looks like we have some sound. I did a couple different ways of doing sound just to so you can compare and contrast. This is the most basic sort of test tone that you can do. I'll zoom in on that. And it's just an oscillator that's called cycle, and that's doing a sinusoid. And I know, wouldn't it be nice if it was called sine wave? Yes, there's lots of weird legacies. And then I have a volume, which is coming from the pressure, and then just a little gain to be able to adjust my output. And then that goes to DAC, which is your digital to audio converter. And that is going through a switch object. So that's just a way of managing some of your, excuse me, rustling there. So that's just a way of managing inputs is on the switch. So what I'm doing here is I want to take MIDI in, and this is kind of a wacky patch because I wanted to be able to fit everything. So I have my load bang that queries for all of the Max, for all of the MIDI devices, and I can actually, I don't even really need to do that. I just have an attribute that pulls up the Sensel Morph, it's there. And then the output of all the MIDI coming in out of here is going into this MIDI MPE parse, so I can get the MIDI data in MPE format. So I can get my notes where I need them, and I can get my gesture data where I need them. In this case, all I really care about is pressure. So that is the connection I have here. So I have my pressure data. Oh, I'm making connections I don't want. Pressure data here, and that's going into something that's just sending that number to a bunch of different places, trigger object. So I'm sending it to all of these little displays that will sort of animate what is going on here. So these are all different ways of taking a ramp. So this is our linear ramp. And so that's 0 to 127. With an exponential thing, we can sort of put more detail up in the higher end. And with a breakpoint, we can make it sort of wacky, so it's high in the middle. So as I push down, it's going to get higher, then it's going to get lower, then it's get higher again, etc. And then this is another example of an exponential is just squared. So you can see it just has a slight curve compared to the other exponent. And how do we do this? There's some simple objects that allow us to do these things. So linear is untouched, and that's what we're hearing right now. So as I use my pressure, we're just getting a linear sort of reaction to that. And now if I try the exponential, that same sort of gesture I'm not getting a lot. I have to dig in because that's where the detail is. And that is done with the magic of the scale object. So this is a really wonderful thing that takes input and just applies some basic algebra and also can apply a curve. So this is saying scale the input of 0 to 127 to 0 to 127. We want the same range, but we were going to do it exponentially. And the sort of value of this, it's kind of a complicated formula. Who cares? You can just try out different values in here. So as I make it 1.02 as the exponent, that actually is not as steep of a curve as, say, 1.09. And just these small changes in values makes a big difference. So again, we can run our little line here that's kind of slowly pressing on this essentially. You can see that's a very steep exponent there. So what if you don't want to do this sort of mathematical curve? What if you really want to customize exactly how it works? That's where the breakpoint is a nice thing. So that is, you can get that from probably up here in the sliders. Good question. I just know that it's called function. Anytime you want an object, you can pull it up. Sorry about the rustling. And just start typing with the sort of great insight that Max has is that everything is a browser. So they kind of try to, or I should say, everything is becoming a browser. So they try to sort of follow that internet habit that we all have of search and how we organize data in tabs and things like that. So if you're not sure, you can actually just, when you create a new object, just with the N key or with the object key, you can just start typing a search value and then it'll pull up relevant results. So I could say breakpoint and, oh wow, that's kind of terrible. There goes my example. I would have hoped that would have pulled it up. All right, cycling, if you're listening, you've got work to do. So function pulls up this UI and there. So that's, you just shift click and it's really like in a DAW like you would use automation curves. This applies automation curves to any input. So we can see what is happening to this breakpoint here. As I take the value from my pressure in and I press lightly and it's pretty high value up at that peak, and now it's going to the valley and now going up to a peak and another valley and another peak. So now you can have a really wacky, and let me go ahead and we can hear that by selecting the breakpoint. So that's actually quite interesting to be able to decouple your gesture from the immediate result. It imparts a sort of almost amplitude modulation, ring modulation on it, if you do it fast enough. And so, yeah, that's just, and again, you have to, this is sort of a basic illustration of how to take this input and modify it and then do something else. But of course, if you want to do something more ornate, you just apply that same idea to whatever inputs you're coming. And because you can break things out by voice, much in the same way I have this switch that is operated by this menu, you could have a switch that's operated by the voice number and be able to manage your streams that way. So that is a kind of really cool thing that you can't do in really a lot of other audio software, particularly in DAWs. You just get that linear modification. Sometimes within soft synths, you'll have a matrix mod and they might have a breakpoint, something like that. But in Max, you can do anything to anything, anywhere, anytime. It's pretty cool. So that is the scaling example. And again, this is on GitHub in the examples in the live stream folder. Some of these other folders that I drill down are going to be elsewhere. So let me check what else I have on my agenda today. The MPE and VST. Yes, I really like this one. Before I get into that, let's see if we have any comments. And I shall get there momentarily. All right. So let's see, Archie Pina. Let's see, I am just tuning in. You had a question, can I specify certain coordinates on the pad for certain actions? Yes, yes you can. You could do that in a couple different ways. So I'm using MPE in this situation. Let me go to Max here. I can sort of demonstrate that in this scaling. You can see that I have, let's see, my X, oh, this is my Y value, and this is my, where's my pitch bend? Pitch bend right here. So these represent Y, X is here, and X and Y there. So you can use those values to, if you wanted to create zones. There's actually a lot more interesting ways to do that rather than using like an overlay. You can use the bare overlay, and that is actually going to be in a future tutorial. So in the next week or two, I will be covering more about how to use the bare pad and sort of treat it as this sort of multi-dimensional XY pad with multiple contacts. So tune in then, because it's pretty involved, but can be fairly, it's not too hard to follow, but I can't just patch it up right now. Let's see. I have the example. So now I have another example that I want to show, and I will dig that up. And this is mostly just working with like the sort of basic example of like, I just want to play a synthesizer in Max, because you might have something that's doing a lot of other different things and you just want to be able to play a synthesizer with MPE. Very rudimentary, but it's also good to know how to do it. So I need to go to my documents, Max 8, projects. Oh, is that what I was? That's not what I was going to show. But we can actually substitute a VST here. And all of our plugins in Max are going to be over here on the left. And I can just search for Quanta, which is a fun one. Ah, okay, there we go. And I'm going to copy that and let me zoom in here so you can see better. And paste replace. I love that. I get excited about these things that caused me great difficulty when I was using Max 20 years ago. So this is just a VST container, and I can, let's see, I will find a keyboard here. So this is sort of the basic way of setting up MPE. So this is obviously more difficult than with a DAW. You have to first get MIDI, you have to get MIDI in and then call it, right. So this is actually the example you were looking for. I happened to pull it up. If I was just going to use this straight MIDI, I will do that example first. So I take a MIDI in object. I'm having all sorts of difficulties with the pad here. MIDI in, and there's a nice little menu here. I want Sensel Morph. Comes in here and comes out here, and that is the most basic way to get things going. So I need to turn MPE on, and that's all good. I'll turn on aftertouch smoothing, why not? All right, you can see me debug. Well, all right, well, this is classic demo fever. Everything's coming the way it's supposed to. All right, now we have noise. So, I guess I just needed to reload it. There we go. Sometimes you just need to try the basics. Good thing I didn't have to restart my machine, huh? So now we have the gestures, and we have a matrix that we can play with and do our sound design as perhaps is more familiar. The cool thing is, so as we explained before, I showed how to control that pressure, and now we can map these gestures to sort of different values. And we can also take in, for example, BEAP objects and add effects. We can add a reverb and just bring that in and put that in the output, and just put the reverb on one channel, for example. You can do all sorts of things that you wouldn't normally do. Things you wouldn't normally do in a regular DAW. You really have a lot of granular control over what's happening. So I guess the next thing I should show is the example that's going on here. And we'll be going into this in more detail in another class. So bring this back to its original intent. And this is probably, yes, so I'm using, I have two of these guys, and it looks like it grabbed this one. Now compare that to how we can play it with this. Oh wait, we can't. I have to undo everything. Much more traditional. And I'm going to redo this and demonstrate this one, just the bare morph. So we've managed to create some sort of really dramatic soundscape by flipping through a couple presets and doing some basic patching. This is using the Sensel object, which I guess I will show you very briefly because it's exciting and will hopefully get you to tune in next time. So what this is doing is it's taking out all of the contacts on the morph and giving you information about each one in excruciating detail. So this is just one touch. You can see all of the things that's coming out about it. Things about angle, pressure, location, and then you can do that to multiple contacts. And what I do, oddly enough, is I turn all of that data into MPE data, so I can easily feed it into a synthesizer, such as Quanta. And just do fantastic things. So that is today's show. I am hot and worn out from doing this. It's very warm in here, and I don't have air conditioning because it's too loud and you would not be able to hear me. So I will depart by going to just me, and I can say goodbye and thank you for joining us. Before I do, let me get the Q&A in. So let me check that out. Right, I cannot forget the Q&A. It doesn't look like we have lots of questions. But again, so there are lots of examples on our GitHub, and that is all linked in YouTube. And you'll be able to poke through those examples. You can look at the video here that's going to be archived on YouTube and Facebook. And you'll be able to follow along with some of those things and maybe dig into them. They're not terribly complicated. You might need a little bit more familiarity with Max. Max has a pretty generous demo time if you're new to it. And of course, if you're already a user, then you can probably just pull everything from our GitHub and just start diving in and pulling it apart. So in our next tutorial series, we'll be diving more into that multi-touch stuff. We will also dive into some visuals, including using the pressure image that comes from your contacts on the morph to create images and warp 3D stuff. Also show some, actually use some basic MIDI with a sort of 3D puppet. There's just tons of really fun examples that we have, and I look forward to sort of diving into detail and showing them to you, because there's just a whole wealth of possibility of interface and expression that you can get out of Max and the Morph. So it's one of my favorite things, and hopefully it can become one of yours. All right, have a good evening.